People say Samsung can't compete. Its phones are boring. The company is coasting. So how can it be that its flagship phone is still more interesting than the equivalent iPhone? Yes, it's time once again to revisit that classic smartphone grudge match with the iPhone 16 Pro Max and Galaxy S24 Ultra. Both excellent handsets, but both from brands which have caught some flack this past year for doing little to really excite smartphone fans. Compared to the AI wizardry of the Google Pixel or the gigantic cameras and batteries of the Chinese brands, these devices are what you could generously call a known quantity. But if you're shopping for a high-end phone with a big screen, especially in the US, chances are these two will still top your list of candidates. So let's see who comes out on top. Of course, this is an Ultra versus Pro Max comparison, so I'm required by law to start this video by referencing just how much of an absolute unit both of these phones are, and for a couple of different reasons. The iPhone this year is just enormous. The jump up to a 6.9-inch display diagonal might not seem like much, but it noticeably affects the hand feel and the visuals of the top-end 2024 iPhone, even if the fundamentals of the iPhone's design language are much the same as they were in 2023. On the Samsung side, not only do you have a similarly large display, but also Samsung's aggressively angular design language to contend with. There's no mistaking the iconic look of the Ultra, especially now that Samsung switched to a completely flat display, but equally those corners are pointy and do not help with ergonomics one bit. On that basis, I have to say the iPhone is just a bit more comfortable to hold and use, even though it is more of a chonker than ever before. Both titanium furnished handsets are available in a selection of typically dull color options, which is a shame, though I guess at least Samsung does offer some more vibrant hues if you buy direct. Otherwise, yeah, I hope you like various flavors of grey. Around front, Apple has its larger dynamic island that's more functional than what you get with the hole punch in the Galaxy, but at the cost of a larger display cutout. And your biometric unlock methods are obviously a bit different as a result, though I think pretty flawless in both phones in their own way. One key difference to note though is that Samsung's Face Unlock is good for authenticating payments, but only via Samsung Pay, not Google Pay. For the latter, you will need a fingerprint or PIN. Both phones are also neck and neck in terms of audio performance from their built-in speakers, and I'm also more than happy with both the displays, though it definitely bears mentioning that Samsung has a unique strength in the form of its Corning Gorilla Armor panel with its reflection-cancelling coating. That makes a big difference in brighter conditions or just any time the display itself is competing with attention from ambient light. The darker pitch blacks of the S24 Ultra are something other phones, including the iPhone, still can't match. Spec-wise, this is somewhat of an unfair fight because the iPhone is almost a generation ahead of the Samsung phone, pitting a Snapdragon 8 Gen 3 against Apple's latest A18 Pro. So no surprise then that the iPhone wins out on some benchmarks, but actually it is a closer contest in some areas than I would have expected, especially in the 3D Mark Solar Bay stress test. In this demanding ray tracing benchmark, the S24 Ultra managed a slightly higher peak loop score, but a lower lowest loop score, pointing to a similar level of graphical performance but more stability on the Apple side. Over in Geekbench though, the generational advantage of the iPhone is plain to see, with significantly higher single and multi-core performance from the A18 Pro compared to the Snap 8 Gen 3. As it stands though, I don't think there's really anything between these two phones in day-to-day performance, and the very slight advantage in the iPhone in graphical performance likely won't translate into any real advantage in most games, with the exception that many developers will likely prioritize optimizing their titles for the iPhone just because it is an iPhone. Also, while both phones do have excellent battery life, I found it was easier to run down the S24 Ultra's cell a little more quickly with extended use outdoors using its extra bright daylight mode. That said, even with a modest difference in battery capacity, these are both phones that will leave you free from battery anxiety, and with lighter use you'll definitely be able to go multiple days between charges. Samsung definitely has a slight edge when it comes to charging speeds though. Although the iPhone and Galaxy can both charge up to 45 watts over USB PD, Samsung seems to charge at a higher wattage level for longer, meaning you'll get more out of a quick opportunistic top-up compared to the iPhone. Apple does obviously have its MagSafe technology at your disposal, which is another level of convenience that has a whole ecosystem of charging accessories behind it. We've yet to see the Qi 2 standard take off much in the Android world though, and any MagSafe compatible case you do buy for the S24 Ultra is likely to cause issues with the S Pen stylus because of the way it works. We're still only dealing with very small differences here though, and I don't think either phone really has an appreciable lead in terms of either longevity or charging speeds. Each of these phones has its own unique hardware features that you won't find anywhere else. Samsung has its S Pen inherited from the Galaxy Note of old. Apple has its new camera control key, a photo-centric addition alongside the programmable action key that we first saw in the 15 series. In terms of giving you a quick way to launch the camera with a single tap, the camera control key is fine, I guess, but this key has also gotten some additional utility in iOS 18.2, where a long press can now let you instantly jump into Apple's visual intelligence. That's the Google Lens plus ChatGPT feature that works surprisingly well and definitely is worth checking out next time you travel. But in terms of helping with day-to-day photography, I'm not so convinced. Although the camera control key placement is easier to reach for me and the Pro Max versus my daily driver, the small iPhone 16 Pro, it's still not any easier to zoom in or change modes versus just tapping the on-screen controls. Scrolling and zooming speed is often too slow and feels imprecise, and in general this feature just feels unusually half-baked for an Apple product. Over on the Samsung side, the S Pen has of course been around since 2011, but it's barely had any new features added over the past half-decade. Of course, it's a neat tool to have at your disposal if you're artistically inclined, but I found it more useful for things like annotating screenshots, occasionally playing around with the sketch-to-image feature, as well as a handy wireless camera mode because of the built-in Bluetooth connectivity. I don't particularly think it's a game changer though, and many of the things that you can do with the S Pen could and have been replicated without a stylus by other manufacturers. Otherwise, the differences between iOS and Samsung's One UI are pretty well known at this point. Samsung software is about to get a big visual overhaul with the arrival of One UI 7, though the core feature set and underpinnings of the Galaxy software remain pretty much the same, save for convenient new UI additions like the handy Now bar. When I'm using a Samsung flagship like this, I appreciate the rich multitasking features that you still can't get on an iPhone outside of basic picture-in-picture, which on a phone of this size still strikes me as kind of insane, but anyway. Apple does offer a surprisingly comprehensive feature set of automation and programmable macros through its Shortcuts app, and in iOS 18 you can now create quick settings shortcuts to these functions. But for my money, it's still generally easier to use a Samsung phone like the S24 Ultra as you would like a regular desktop computer with a file system and third-party apps and all that jazz, right up to the ability to effectively host a full Android desktop instance thanks to the fully featured DeX desktop mode that really does unlock the full power of this phone. With Apple, for me, it's all about that ecosystem. Now, sure, Samsung has built out a lot of its own offerings lately, to the point where you can now seamlessly multi-screen across a Samsung phone and laptop. And there are similar collaborative features for things like clipboard sharing too. And Microsoft and Google now have things like Quick Share for easy file sharing. But Apple remains the master of the ecosystem, and of course also ecosystem lock-in. And if you use a Mac or an Apple Watch or anything in the iPhone's digital orbit, there are plenty of subtle conveniences that come into play, whether it's AirDrop, the seamlessness of Apple Pay across all three of those devices, unlocking your watch from your phone or vice versa, and let's not forget Apple's tracking network, which is tough to beat by any rival. AI is the big new addition for both brands this year, and Apple's gone big on promoting Apple Intelligence as a major new iPhone feature, even if many of its much vaunted capabilities are now only just launching in a few countries outside the US. Meanwhile, Samsung's had its Galaxy AI suite for a while, with a couple of new additions coming in One UI 7. I guess the biggest difference here in the approach to AI is that Samsung's are much more individual features, whereas Apple definitely has those, see Image Playground for example, but Apple's also trying to incorporate AI more into the core OS with features like AI notification summaries for example, and the upcoming ChatGPT integration into Siri and visual intelligence in iOS 18.2. In some instances, this additional jolt of AI can be very impressive, but it also requires some rewiring of your smartphone muscle memory to make the most of it. Case in point, most iPhone users were used to the old Siri, which let's face it was pretty dumb. Samsung does have some impressive individual features though, like image expansion and intelligent moving and replacement of objects in photos. That's something that's only just starting to become possible in the latest version of Photos in iOS. And Samsung's AI-inferred slow-mo for video is also very impressive, artificially injecting additional frames into 30 or 60 FPS footage for additional smoothness. It's also worth calling out how interpreter mode has improved in leaps and bounds since the S24 Ultra's launch, to the point where it's actually pretty useful now and doesn't get tripped up as much by accents and context. To be honest though, I am slightly underwhelmed by the AI features in both of these phones. The really useful AI tricks I find myself using, like photo editing, object removal and the like, have already been pioneered and built upon by Google. And things like notification summaries and instant call transcriptions could be handy, but they're hardly everyday conveniences for most people. Whether or not either of these two phones has the very best camera setup is debatable. Nevertheless, they still rank near the top with enough lenses to be versatile and high quality post-processing. Both phones feature similarly sized primary cameras, though with a 48 megapixel resolution on the iPhone versus 200 with the Galaxy. Apple's ultra-wide makes the jump also to 48 megapixels this year versus 12 on the S24 Ultra, and meanwhile you're looking at two telephoto cameras with Samsung, a very basic 10 megapixel 3x and a beefier 5x 50 megapixel periscope versus just a single 5x shooter with Apple, largely the same as last year's Pro Max. With each camera in full auto mode, you'll notice a few differences in color reproduction. Apple favors a slightly less saturated look and somewhat warmer colors overall compared to Samsung, with its cooler hues that are more apparent in daylight shots like these. And this is a trend you'll see across the entire loadout of cameras with these phones, though obviously with Apple you can fine-tune the look of pictures with the new undertones controls. On the Samsung side, you've got a more traditional rota of filters to choose from. If you've got time to frame your shot and tweak your undertones to your own liking, then great, but for me, I'm more of a fire and forget kind of photographer. I'll deal with editing my shots later down the line. You can see just a little bit more of a punch of color with shots from the Galaxy by default compared to the iPhone, but the days of Samsung flagships producing aggressively oversaturated images are largely behind us. Shots look pretty natural in the grand scheme of things, with a little nudge of extra vibrance in areas like daytime skies and skin tones. Samsung does have a reputation for flubbing shots of moving subjects, and although I'm finding it has improved with the S24 compared to previous Ultras, you can definitely see the difference in processing with anything that has a tendency to move around a lot. The easiest way to demo this is with a pendulum, which the iPhone and Pixel and others are able to capture more sharply than the Galaxy. Ultra-wide performance is more of a level playing field with a similar field of view. I think I prefer the iPhone's color science in a lot of these shots just because on occasion Samsung did seem to capture some quite cold looking ultra-wide pictures, though this definitely did vary depending on weather conditions. On some rare occasions, the warmer output of the iPhone actually ended up looking a bit less accurate. Though that said, Apple's post-processing I felt did a better job of resolving detail around the edges of the frame than Samsung, whose ultra-wide captures were grainier in this area when not using night mode. Telephoto performance is a real mixed bag, in part because Samsung really does deserve some criticism for sticking with its ancient and outdated 3x 10 megapixel mini telephoto camera going into 2025. Comparing it to a 3x digital crop from the iPhone, this dedicated 3x camera really struggles to justify its existence. It's barely any sharper and is noticeably weaker in low light, to the point where the camera app will often default to a digital crop of the primary anyway. Switching up to 5x, it's a clear win for Samsung though. As I've noted in previous iPhone comparisons over the past year, Apple's 5x shooter is considerably weaker compared to much of the Android competition, especially in daylight scenes where Apple prioritizes faster captures versus more aggressive multi-frame processing. As a result, you can clearly see more noise and grain in most 5x shots from the iPhone's camera compared to Samsung's, and due to its higher res, the Galaxy also has a longer usable zoom range, extending far beyond the iPhone's software limit of 25x. Surprisingly, the iPhone's 5x is actually more competitive relative to Samsung in lower light conditions. As you can see here, there's less of a difference in the level of detail and noise when using night mode, and the same applies to the ultra-wide cameras as well. Neither ultra-wide is great in low light, but there's really very little in it when you hit that night mode toggle. Around front, the biggest difference I noticed with the selfie shooter was the slightly wider field of view with the iPhone's camera, and also Apple's tendency not to overexpose skin tones quite as much when using night mode out and about. Overall though, both very decent selfie performers with not a whole lot between them, as you can see here. Video performance is an area of traditional strength for Apple, of course, and the iPhone 16 Pro Max does of course include those usual bells and whistles like ProRes RAW support and new additions like 120 FPS slow-mo capture. Over on the Samsung side, you've got a slightly higher max resolution available to you, up to 8K with 30 FPS, though mainly that's just there for bragging rights. Looking at footage between these two side by side at a more reasonable 4K 30, I think Samsung generally offers slightly smoother looking footage when moving thanks to its video stabilization feature. Though I find myself preferring the color reproduction of the iPhone instead. That extra touch of saturation that you get in the Samsung video in some cases can leave that footage appearing a little overcooked. That's especially true in some lower light shots, for example, as you can see in the pavement in this footage. Nighttime video from both cameras can be a bit of a mixed bag, and you definitely feel the lack of a larger image sensor with both of these cameras, as well as the lack of more robust AI-based processing like Google offers through its night sight video. I feel like Samsung does a slightly better job here in low light just because more colors are retained, and although the processing is more aggressive, there's less grain left behind as a result, even when shooting with the ultra-wide. And telephoto video follows a similar pattern to still photography, with a reasonable showing from the iPhone, though with noticeably more grain to footage on account of that smaller sensor. With Samsung at 5 times, even in daylight, you can see a pretty big difference here in terms of color reproduction, sharpness, and noise. So if I had to choose one of these two to use for the next couple of years, as much as I do like the iPhone's ecosystem and everything it allows me to do with my other Apple products, I'd have to go with the S24 Ultra. Samsung makes better use of its larger canvas with software features that feel at home on that bigger display, and the screen itself looks better to me with its unique anti-reflection coating. And although Samsung is by no means without serious competition in photo and videography, its camera system has the added versatility of a really great 5x telephoto that puts Apple to shame in many situations. In enough other areas, it's kind of a wash. Neither company's AI toys really compel me enough to move the needle, and the same applies to their unique hardware tricks like the S Pen and camera control key. They're fine, but I don't miss them when they're not there. And so ultimately, although both are great performers, for me, I think it is a narrow win for Samsung. But that's just my opinion. Hit the comments, let me know what you think. If you've used either of these two phones, which would you choose and why? Stick around and subscribe for more comparisons coming very soon, along with, of course, our coverage of the S25 Ultra. For now though, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.